from Eurogamer and welcome to the first day of developer sessions at Res 2017. Hi to everybody watching live on Twitch as well. Coming up later today, we've got sessions on Prey, Divinity Original Sin 2, Knights and Bikes, and from William Pugh of Stanley Parable fame. But to kick things off, joining me on stage in conversation and making his first public appearance in 2 years, we have a very special guest. He's worked on games like Thief, System Shock, and Freedom Force, and of course he's best known as the creative force behind Bioshock. Now he's starting out on a new adventure at his new studio, Ghost Story Games. Please welcome Ken Levine. All right, so to start off with, I'm going to take you back right to the beginning, before you joined the games industry. What games really struck a chord with you back then as a player?
Well, I go so far back that the first games I ever played were actually not even video games. They were these sort of electromechanical games in the arcade. Like these old games, like a baseball game where like a metal pinball would come down and you like hit a button and the bat would hit it and physically that thing would fly and you'd like knock over these little like tin figures and stuff. So I'm not like that old. But I think the first probably game I ever played was when they were coming out, or like Pong, like in real time, because I was seeing as a kid I was seeing those games come out, Pong and Space Invaders and Adventure and all those games. But I think the games that really stuck with me when a lot of microprose games like Civilization. I've been playing Civilization now for. I had 25 years since the first Civilization, like 1991. That had huge impact on me, and I just keep playing every iteration. But the game that probably was most formative for me as a game designer was playing Ultima Underworld. That sense of being in a place, of being in a world, and where there's a set of rules that sort of that makes sense and that are intuitive. And like if you play the new Zelda, I think you can draw a line from Ultima Underworld to the new Zelda in the sense that those are games that just sort of, if it seems intuitive, you can kind of do it. So Zelda's been a big thrill because it kind of brings me back. That's sort of my imagination added to Ultima Underworld. A lot of elements that maybe weren't even there at the time, because we tend to do that with games, right? We tend to sort of think they actually are more complex and richer than they actually are, and that's kind of the fun of it. And Zelda is one of those games that, new one, that sort of really pays off that promise.
You studied drama and you wrote some screenplays, but what was it that drew you back into the games industry, into the job at Looking Glass?
Failure. Terrible, miserable failure. I was a screenwriter, and at a very young age, I got an agent. I got, flown out to Hollywood. I was like 19 years old, and they flew me out first class, and I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And I met all these Hollywood people, and they were my best friend, and they were awesome. And then I did one movie, and it didn't work out so well, and then those friends started disappearing, and I wasn't ready for it. I was, I think there's probably a lot of young developers out here, or young students, that it's hard when you're, 20, 21 years old, and you're sort of dealing with people who are really seasoned in like breaking people's hearts. And, the world will do that, right? Especially with creative people. The world breaks the hearts of creative people. And I think a really important part of being a creative person is not do what I did, which is like disappear and not be a creative person for like 6 years. And then that's what I was doing. I was like a computer consultant, which is fine, but I wasn't happy because I wasn't doing creative work. And finally, I saw an ad for a job at Looking Glass, and I've been such a fan of Ultima Underworld and System Shock 1. And I was like, well, I'll apply for this game design job. I didn't even really know what a game design job was. Back then, it wasn't like it is now, where there's schools and there's a whole sort of infrastructure, and there was, developers programs and indie gaming things. It was just, there was no sort of clear path. And somehow I got it, and the first day I showed up, I was a Star Trek game that got canceled, a Star Trek Voyager game that got canceled. But I was half my day was on that, and half of it was on Thief. And so I worked with Doug Church, which was my mentor, and we just sort of sat in a room. It was a great company. It was sort of like half game studio, half school, So I would come in and I would sit at Doug's feet, and not literally, but he would, we'd just kick around ideas for this new game, which was at that time just called Action RPG. I think that was what the studio called it. And it was like, beyond that, it was up to us to figure out. And Doug and I went through like 5 or 6 different, maybe more, ideas. And I would write out full plot lines. And at one point, the game was called Dark Camelot, and you played Mordred, but he was actually a good guy, and Arthur was the bad guy. At one point, it was called Dark Elves Must Die, actually, at one point. At one point, it was called Better Red Than Undead, which added like all different genres. That was like a zombie game set in the Cold War. And eventually, Paul Morat came in and said, well, if you made a game about a thief? And Doug and I always had this one idea that lasted through all these iterations, and that idea was, would it be really cool if you're walking around the world and it was dark and the guard said, somebody there? Instead of just seeing you and attacking you. That was sort of the big idea that no matter what happened, we just kept staying with that idea. I think Paul intuited that, a thief game, a stealth game. And there wasn't really a clear model for a first-person stealth game at that point. And we just I said it was great. Actually, I think Doug wasn't crazy about the idea, and I was really crazy about it. Mostly because I think I just wanted it to end. We've done so many games, like months and months, but that failure of idea after idea and investing all this time and coming up with all these characters and working with Rob Waters to concept art and having my heart broken over and over and over again, I think that was one of the best lessons I ever had, because it showed me that ideas are important, but they're pretty relatively easy to generate versus execution. And so you have to be comfortable, just smothering those babies in the crib. Not literally. Levine says smother babies in crib. So that heartbreak was one of the most valuable lessons Doug taught me, is that, look, it doesn't matter how many ideas you have. At the end of the day, the idea has to be great enough that the audience is going to fall in love with it. And also, you have to be in love with it enough, because you're marrying that idea. That's going to be years of your life. So you should be, it's like dating. You date a lot of people, but if you're going to, commit, you better be pretty sure that this person's the right person and that idea is the right idea. So, kill your babies.
So you left Looking Glass to found Irrational, but you say working closely with them on System Shock 2. That's still considered a hugely influential game, and you often return to parts of it in your subsequent work. Did you know you were onto something really special back then?
No, I mean, there's the 3 co-founders of Irrational, only one of us, you guys hear me by the way, okay? Okay. With the 3 co-founders, only one of us had ever shipped a game before. Ralph Vernier and John Shea and I hadn't shipped a game. And so we were just like every day figuring out what the hell we were supposed to be doing. I was also running the company, right? So I had to deal with like payroll and insurance and all this crap, which I had no idea about. I had no interest in it either, but you gotta pay people. So you have to figure it out. And so we were so desperate just to keep our heads above water, we didn't even have time to think about the future. Just try to get the thing done. And I think I learned a lesson then that the most important thing is to make something that you want to play. Because then you have a chance, that love that you put into that. If you don't love it, nobody else is going to. So we did, the best about System Shock 2 is we were basically given free rein to make the game we wanted to make. And we made the game we wanted to play.
After System Shock 2 came Freedom Force and then of course Bioshock. Now Bioshock's got really strong historical and political elements, but it's still essentially a work of science fiction and fantasy, and this seems to be quite a common thread in your work, and you said that your next game is going to be a sci-fi game. What do you think draws you back to science fiction and storytelling when you also seem to want to engage with like real world issues?
Then I said, I saw this great interview with Rod Serling. You guys know Rod Serling, Twilight Zone? And this is like 1959. It was Mike Wallace interviewing Serling. It was actually just like this, right? But of course they're both smoking like 15 cigarettes in a row because it was 1959, and they're in suits. And Serling was talking about how he had done a lot of sort of political stuff, and he is constantly getting in trouble. And he had written a film called Judgment at Nuremberg about the Nuremberg trials, and there was a line talking about the gas chambers in it, and one of the sponsors of the show was a gas company, and so they did not want any mention of the gas chambers. And he's like, so now I'm doing a science fiction show, this right before the product came out, and has no political content, no ideas about society at all. It's just fun, it's just science fiction. Of course, he was completely lying, because he knew what he was doing, which was, okay, A, you do science fiction, you can make it. You're not immediately turning people off with ideas because you're not sort of saying, oh, that candidate you like, or that person you like, or that policy you like, well, I'm attacking that. You sort of you move back and you talk about universal themes, you talk about metaphorical themes. I think people are more open to listening and engaging because they don't feel like they're being lectured at. And I think that's the key job of the artist, is how do you convey ideas where you're inviting people in to a conversation rather than telling them what to think. And so metaphor, science fiction, fantasy is a great place. Star Trek, the original Star Trek was almost all commentary, but done through brilliant and thoughtful and imaginative metaphor.
So it's now a new studio for you with a new name, Ghost Story Games, and a much smaller team there. Does that change the creative process for you?
Yeah, we're all it's a group of people who founded the company together. We sort of came up with the principles of the company. We call them pillars of the company, which is like, how do you want to work on this? How do you want to work together? Because Irrational had been around a long time, so there was a lot of things established, so people would come and sort of encounter this big thing sort of set in stone. And we said, well, this is an opportunity as co-founders to come up with, how do we want to make games? What kind of game do we want to make? How do we want to work together? What do we want our work-life balance to be? All those kind of things. And we're small enough that everybody's in the same room. Everybody interviews every candidate who comes into the company. Everybody has to sign off on those candidates who come because they're joining part of the team. And we all want to, it's like America. So it's a lot level of intimacy, which brings me back to sort of System Shock 2 days, because again, we're a very small team in one room, and I think that's I think for me, I sort of ended up doing larger things by accident almost, because that's a natural thing. You do one game, and you do the next game, and that's got to be bigger, and that's got to be bigger. But it was kind of nice to be back with a very small group of guys who I'd worked with before, and we hired a bunch of other men and women to come join the organization, and it's just a really nice place to be. It's a really fun and creative place to be.
And presumably a smaller team means a smaller budget and different expectations for the game. Does that mean you can do different things with the game? Can you make it tougher or deeper? Or
Yeah, I mean, look, the rule, and I sort of mentioned this before, but the rule we follow it is, what do we want to make? What's the game we want to play? What do we feel is missing out there? And we just make that. And it's the team, because it's small enough, everybody's engaged in the conversation. So it's really this great collaboration where we're just making the thing we want to make. And, we don't really know if people are going to care, and I think that if you worry too much about that, that becomes that voice in your head, which isn't necessarily healthy. The same way as System Shock 2, we just made the game we wanted to make, and I didn't even know enough to know what the audience would care about then, because I was so new at it. I was sort of going back to that place where you allow yourself to not think about that. You allow yourself not to think about the market. You allow yourself not to think about, 15 marketing people lining up and asking you questions about it. You just make something that you think is cool.
You said you're going to aim to create a very replayable narrative game. Now, this is a holy grail in gaming. Some have considered impossible. Are there any games out there that you think are making good progress towards that aim?
So there's this great video. Do you guys know who Chris Crawford is? Yes, probably some of you do. So he's old school. Chris was making games on the Atari 400 back in the day. And Chris did this epic speech, and I think he co-founded GDC. He did this epic speech about 20 years ago or something at GDC about this exact problem. How do you make a replayable narrative game really meaningful and replayable? And he called it the dragon. This was his challenge. He identified as his dragon, and he was going to slay this dragon. And at the end of the speech, you can imagine doing this now. At the end of the speech, Crawford draws a sword, an actual sword out of like a scabbard, and he goes, "Dragon!" Like, I can't remember exactly saying this, "Dragon, I'm coming for you, and I'm gonna get you!" And he runs out of the room screaming, and this video is online, search for like Chris Crawford dragon speech. And it's amazing because there's a guy who's really passionate about it. And I think it's been it was a very hard ball to crack. I don't know if he necessarily has cracked it yet. We're taking a very different approach to the problem, much more of a, and I come from a narrative background, so I probably think about things differently than a guy who comes from a programming background. And it's a really, really hard problem, and that's why we spent the last, sort of 2 years, more years, just sort of sitting in a room doing R&D and coming up with this approach. And it's totally different way of making a game than I've ever done before. You have to throw away a lot of assumptions about how we have made games. For me, got a little comfortable with making games a certain way. I made sort of 3 games that were, from a lot of ways, similar in how they were constructed. System Shock 2 and Bioshock Infinite. There was a lot of differences between those games, but how you thought about narrative, how you thought about levels, how you thought about quest structure, all somewhat similar. This is completely different and super challenging, but fortunately we have people who are willing to pass to do it multiple times. But it's been really interesting.
So are you going to slay the dragon?
What?
Are you going to slay the dragon?
I'm going to slay him, or he's going to kick my ass. Like one of those two things is going to happen. It's going to be, no matter what happens, I'm going to be very glad we did this, because I think narrative has sort of been this thing that great narrative in games has sort of lived on a parallel path from the gameplay experience. Where you sort of have chunks of narrative and chunks of gameplay. I mean, you start to see the game that I think inspired me most, that we were maybe onto something on the right track, was Shadows of Mordor, with the Nemesis system, which is my favorite part of that game. And that's a very limited, rudimentary approach to it that covers a very narrow area. But boy, when I sort of understood that I could kill whatever orc boss I wanted, whatever order I wanted, and really drive, who I would kill, who I would convert, all that stuff. It's more of a meta-narrative, and there's not a lot of dialogue support for that stuff, so our thing is much more ambitious. But they really, and I haven't seen that much about the new game, and I'm guessing they're probably going to double down on that, because I thought that was incredibly successful. That sort of gave us, like, okay, maybe we're not completely crazy in what we're trying to do.
Should we take some questions from the floor? Can we get a mic up at the front, and if you can come and queue behind the mic, and we'll take your questions.
Just right here?
Perfect.
I am a huge fan, and I'm not trying to be a super fan, but thank you first for being awesome.
Thank you.
I'm an audio guy, and I want to pick your brains a bit. How important is audio design to your design process? And how early do you bring it in? How do you think about it? And how do you make sure you hire the right people to make all of that sound great?
It's about half of what we do, I think, in the experience, especially for us. The audio is, I think, from our games, it's inconceivable they would be nearly as successful without guys like Eric Brosius and guys like Pat Balthrop and guys like Jim Bonney and Jeff Seenster and Scott Haraldson and all these other, and Emily Ridgway, all these other amazing people who've been part of our audio teams over time. I got lucky. Eric Brosius I met at Looking Glass, and he was just this genius, and this is back in the day before audio was really a thing. And, I remember the first time I heard, because I played System Shock 2, I never played it when it was, because System Shock 2 when it came out, it's old enough that the first one was on floppy disk. System Shock 1, sorry, was on floppy disk. And there was no audio logs or speech or anything, it was all text. And then they released a CD-ROM version that they ended up recording the audio, and it was like a completely different experience because Eric's, just the treatment of Showdown's voice is still, there's nothing like it. Like, it's just, the genius of that and the amount of handcrafted work in that. He didn't just throw a filter on it. Everything was touched by him. And then, working with Pat, say, on BioShock 1, and working on the vending machine sounds and sitting there and talking about old, these electromechanical games I was talking about before. That's where those sounds of a lot of the machines in BioShock 1 came from, was me thinking back to that experience of all those great old electromechanical machines. So it's half. It's absolutely half of what we do.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi. So, you're, it's hard to know, you're really influential to aspiring designers and developers since BioShock 1, myself included.
Thank you.
Inspired me to come to this industry. So I just wanted to ask, what do you feel are the hardest decisions to make, and when you know how to stop iterating or designing on something? How do you know when it's, at the right point, that you're not messing with something that's not broken?
I don't want to break your heart here, but you never know.
Okay.
And in fact, it's never at the right point, because you could anything you can keep working on and making it better. I don't believe there's ever a time where you can't keep polishing something and make it better. At some point, just the practical reality of the universe, whether it's money or whether it's, hey, we're only on this planet for so long, right? That you don't want to make one game and then die. So you gotta cut it off somewhere. It's one of the hardest. If the money pressure sometimes decides it for you, right? But without that, it's just saying, okay, this is what the game's going to be. And I had a conversation this last night where people were talking about games that go on for a very long time, like 5 years, and what happens is eventually people realize time's out, and almost every game I've ever worked on, I don't know if this is the same for you, but you realize you're running out of time, and then you make the game. Like, you sort of dick around for like years, and then you're like, oh my god, we're almost out of time, and it forces you to make these decisions, and that's when the magic happens, is when the gun's at your head, and you've got to make the decisions, because we tend to procrastinate, and we tend to sort of put things off. And I find when it's time to, what do we keep, what do we cut, what do we focus on, what do we polish, that's really when the game's made. So it can be a very helpful thing too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned the Twilight Zone. Last year there was an announcement that you were working on an interactive version of the Twilight Zone. Can you tell us how that's going?
I'm deciding, it's in flux, and I'm deciding what I want to do about it. And it's kind of a complicated thing to get on the stage here, but look, all creative products generally almost every creative thing you do in life is probably going to fail. Almost every idea you have, almost everything, and you decide, and right now it's at the stage where I'm still deciding whether this is something that I want to be doing, but every project is complicated, every project is tricky. And there's some really things I'm excited about it. I love the Twilight Zone, some challenges, some other challenges, but so I don't know yet.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
You talk about Shadows of Mordor and the Nemesis system. Are you surprised no one else has latched onto that kind of idea for the gameplay to make things where he kicks and kills you and makes them more powerful and remembers what you've done to them? There's one thing I love about Shadows of Mordor is you kill say a boss, like burning them, it'll come back and you burnt my face. Are you surprised no one else has taken that kind of idea?
So there's a term we have in the studio which is called radical recognition. And what that means is if the gamer does something, the game should recognize it, and the game should talk about it. Like there was a thing back in System Shock 1, which just because I didn't work on, I worked on System Shock 2, where you do this roller skate jump. They have these weird roller skate power thing in System Shock 1. You make this jump over this pit, and there's a line they recorded in it, and it's not dynamic at all. It's just like the line recorded, Shodan goes, next jump. And that was a moment which I'd never seen before, where the game recognized some just thing you did in the world, right? And so one of the most important things about what we're doing now is this concept of radical recognition, like in Mordor, that the player does something, the game should, as often as we can, recognize that accomplishment or failure or whatever it is, and find ways to have the world feedback that it cares. So I thought that was a great system. There's so many small innovative ideas in there, but the heart of that is something that's central to our game, which is recognizing the player's presence in the world. And that's why we play games, right? We play games so we can have an impact on the world. That's what's the difference between games and movies, right? If you could probably define it in one sentence, there's a million other differences. Movies don't give a crap about you. Games do. And we want to keep pushing on that and hiding that. That's one of our central tenets.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. When you think about this new narrative-driven game we're doing, do you think the Telltale games have any sort of influence over that, or have any importance to replayability, or do you take anything from that?
Right. So Telltale games, which are awesome and amazing, and do a great job of incorporating story and recognizing player action. They're still sort of built on a different model of sort of more of a branching structure model, where underpinning, it's kind of hard to talk about in sort of this forum, but underpinning, our game is a deeply systemic game, underpinning everything from gameplay to narrative. And we don't think the audience, the goal is to think of deeply systemic games. Systemic games can react to player action, right? Like Civilization can react on a very microcosmic level to the player's actions. But to be able to then have the narrative that seems like a traditional, or kind of, if you like our other games, one of those kind of narratives that can react and comment on much more small level actions the player takes. That's the goal. So it's built from a fundamentally different model, but those guys do a great job with those games, and they really push narrative forward in video games. So kudos to them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. You spoke earlier about the usage of meta-narrative and using metaphor and fantastical situations in order to lead people to realisations that they may not accept as readily under more frontal and less ambiguous contexts. How do you balance that with situations that are so fantastical that the ideas you're trying to put across don't quite work in the same way, like the X-Men problem of providing analogies for bigotry and stuff like that with subpopulations that can blow your head up with their mind,
Right.
which doesn't work like that in real life. Like, I thought BioShock 1 did that really well, but a lot of games and television series and movies and stuff do it in really ham-handed way that just doesn't work quite as well? How do you balance that?
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that, right? Because it's not like those guys said, we're going to make something really ham-handed. You get out of bed in the morning and you say, what do I want to do? And you go to work and you do your best. And I think the question, the story has to come first, right? The story absolutely comes first. If you don't have a good story, if you don't have character, and characters are the heart of the story. Characters and conflict are the heart of the story. The moment your character feels like he is representing a point of view, and his job in the world is to be a point of view versus a person who's got problems and wants and needs and conflicts and foibles and somebody who completely has problems even living up to their own ideals, I think then you're losing the plot. Then you're just, but there's no easy answer for it. It's sort of like, do good stories, not bad stories. And that's a terrible piece of advice. It's a joke we actually have. It's like, hey, can you do that sound really good? We make those kind of jokes in the studio because we've all had those notes from executives where it's like, I remember actually Eric Rosius, the sound guy I was talking about before, some executive came to him once during System Shock 2 and he said, it's really important the sound is good in this game. And Eric was like, noted. Because what do you do with that advice? Like, oh shit, I meant to make it terrible. There it is. So unfortunately, it's just be as honest with yourself and as tough on yourself as you can be, but not too tough because you don't want to, end up, staring at a black pit of despair. But it requires you being tough on yourself. It requires you going out. Look, here's the most important thing I can say. Solicit opinions from as many places as you can, but you do not have to listen to all those opinions. But hear as many opinions as you can. Be open to it. You have to form yourself into a creature who is impervious to reacting to somebody not liking your stuff because you just have to listen. Because you'll never be there. When your game comes out, you're not going to show up in somebody's living room and they're about to have a shelf moment with your game. Say, no, don't turn the game off. Here's why it's awesome. Doug Church and I used to joke about that we would ship a video of Thief explaining why the game was fun. And you want to do that, right? We call it in the studio, we call it being player-facing, meaning the gamer has no reason to like our game. They don't know us. In fact, they have reason to dislike the game because we're asking them for money. We're saying, oh yeah, you make $15 an hour. Well, why don't you take 4 hours of your life and buy our game with it? 4 hours at your miserable job that you hate and give it to us. Just give us that money. Give it to us. And they're like, no, screw you, dude. I'm not going to give you your advice. So they're disinclined to like what you have. So get in front of as many people as you can who will keep you honest, but you don't have to listen to them. You choose when you listen to them. You don't have to act on it, but you should hear them and you should listen to them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi there. So all the games you've worked on have had incredibly infamous endings. What do you think contributes to a really phenomenal ending in a video game?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best guy to ask because I think a lot of our endings have kind of sucked. The first ending, you might remember fighting a giant naked dude at the end of the BioShock 1.
That was perfect. Perfect in every way, don't change a thing.
Somebody sent me a texture map, and apparently his butthole was fairly well rendered. And I'm like, what were you thinking, Levine? That was like a tweet. And I was like, oh, I don't know, dude. I'm sorry. Sorry about the butthole. And I've been happy with a couple of endings. Look, it's tough. Endings are sticking the landing is tough, and I think it's don't change what you've been doing. Don't make a radical shift in tone. Don't make a radical shift in. Don't change. I kind of feel the same way about boss fights, which we also do badly. We've also traditionally done not very well, because boss fights often require a real change in tone and how you play the game. I much prefer games where bosses are much more organic things that you can use the same set of tools to fight that you've used everywhere else versus like jumping on the red spot on their head. I think those things are tough because consistency and feeling like it's part of the overall experience really matters, but they're tricky. They're tricky. How do you wrap this whole thing up, and put a bow on it? It's a really hard problem, but I say making it organic to the rest of the experience is probably the best idea, but I think there are probably better people you can ask than me.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Hi, Ed. The question I wanted to ask is, because the games are becoming more realistic, and a lot of people would agree with me on this, would there be any games that you'd be making to do with the realisticness of games?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Like, because they've got this VR and it feels realistic to the player, would there be games that you'd be making to make them feel more experienced when it comes to maybe fighting bosses or fighting certain enemies at all?
I don't think realism, I think you can probably tell from the games I've made, super hyper-realism has never been a focus of mine. There's a lot of visual abstractions in what we do, even Bioshock B, there's a lot of characters not really entirely realistic looking. And System Shock 2, they're really not realistic looking, but that wasn't a choice. That was a sort of dark engine, goofy, 100 polygon character models. So I've sort of never sort of been ripped from the headlines or make sure that that MP5 or whatever the gun is entirely accurately modeled. We usually work in that for, and so it's never really been a goal of mine. But in terms of like VR and stuff, there is a striking thing to be transported in a place like that. And I think the notion of being transported to somewhere else, really transported, is very appealing. I think VR is still in its early days, but I've always been very enamored with the idea of building a place that feels coherent more than realistic. I think is for me been a goal.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. As a voice actor, I really love the fact that you're talking about more narrative and story. For us, it's music to our ears, so thank you for that. But on that point, how important is it for you to get that voice right as a developer and for the gamer as well? You talk about realistic characters, and the voice has to be key in that.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to that super stunning revelation moment I had here in the CD version of System Shock 2, of System Shock 1, and realizing what performance can do to a game. And I've always, I come from theater, that was my background. So working with actors is something I've always done in my life, and being a writer, it's funny, we talked about the Twilight Zone thing before, and my work as a screenwriter. I'm not actually sure I'm a particularly strong writer. I think I'm a good writer-director, because I rewrite in recording sessions all the time, working with the actor, right? Because you hear their voice, and you have to, you can tell them, no, do it this way, but if it's just not coming out right, you have an instrument to work with there, and you've got to retune your writing to work with that instrument. And so I've always loved working with actors. I've always, and like this time, we spent a lot of time. We don't have a huge cast on this one. It's a much smaller cast than what we worked with before, but fortunately I've been able to, I have a lot of people have a lot of experience with the work before, but also finding some new people. It's performances. It's actors are a big part of what we do because character is a big part of what we do, and finding an actor who can portray that honesty and who honestly can portray the character is incredibly important for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, so all the games that you've worked on, to what extent have you sort of stuck completely to your original plan for the game, and to what extent has final design decisions sort of happened during the course of development, and which of those things have sort of led to, you think, the most successful aspect of it?
So I'll ask you a question. What do you mean by original plan? You mean the first day you had the conception for this thing?
Well, the way I imagined it is you sit down before you start and you make a plan for what this is going to be. But then
it doesn't really. Yeah, you do. At least for me, I can't speak for all developers. Like people always ask me, how much of your original conception of GameX stayed. And I always never really know what original conception was. So frankly, I don't even remember, over years you kind of forget what happens and what changes, but change is the norm. Change and evolution is the norm. Because what is the original plan? I mean, who cares if the next day you realize that there's a different way to go? There's nothing holy about the original idea. Like I gave you, the example I gave of what happened with Thief, right? It went through iteration after iteration after iteration. That was before even what we decided what the game was. And even so, if you know anything about the history of Thief, you played that game 2 months before it came out, it was not Thief. It was nothing. Those guys really came together. I mean, there was a lot of great ideas that are working around, but the whole thing did not gel with the game experience at all. And that happens a lot, maybe not 2 months, that was pretty close to the bone. But games really gel over time, and you should be open to change. You should be absolutely open to change. And but you also, there's another problem you have to watch out for, is the new shiny idea. It's like, people are in relationships and they start thinking about, well, maybe that other girl, she doesn't have any of the problems as my current girlfriend. If I broke up my girlfriend with her girlfriend, and every relationship has problems, right? Everything has, and sometimes the new and shiny is exciting, and sometimes when things get really hard, like, well, screw this, we're going to do something new and shiny. And in reality, your original idea probably has a lot of merit. You just have to work through the problems, because you start on the new thing, and boom, 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 the problems will start lining up. And so it's a really hard balance, and it's one of those things that, again, I wish there was a hard and fast rule I could share with you, but I'd be lying to you.
Thanks so much.
Hey, Dan.
Hey.
Literally a quick question for the end. I wanted to ask, as your first IP for your sort of Ghost Story, what sort of, say, elements and sci-fi-esque ideas have you got from any other games that have come out in the recent years, like Fallout 4, let's say Mass Effect Andromeda, those sci-fi aspects? Would you say there's anything that you're grabbing from that at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think all games are the parents of other games, right? Like there's always, we embrace, and we borrow, we steal, we can't help it. Like we're shaped by the things we love. I think this is, I don't know, I have to think about, from a narrative standpoint, there's really nothing quite like it, like the world, the setting. I mean, it's science fiction, so yeah, I mean, it's a science fiction game, and you can see similarities to some Shock 2 there, because, that's sort of, we tend to like contained environments, but, there's a reason System Shock 2 is on the spaceship, there's a reason that Bioshock was under, this city under the ocean, because that sort of allows us to create a more coherent world, and we have a different kind of ambition than say Bethesda does, who wants to create this hugely expansive world. Hugely expansive world. And so we tend to focus on a very detailed, smaller world. That's consistent for us. But I don't know. I think the game, here's I'll say this. I think something that's been very exciting for me is coming from gaming, in the 80s and even the 70s for me, games used to be very, very difficult. And sometimes intimidating, and sometimes overwhelming, and rewarded players who are willing to spend the time to really invest, right? And that kind of went away. When the rise of the consoles and stuff like that kind of went away for a while, because the goal was to expand your market and to make things super intuitive for everybody. It's got to be for everybody. And the way things have evolved in the past few years is not everything has to be for everybody anymore. And that's been a big relief for me, because, certainly System Shock 2 wasn't for everybody, like it was a pretty hardcore experience. And to be able to go back and not have to worry about making something that's appealing to everybody, and really just say, what do we want to make? And, are people going to be willing to come and see this experience and be challenged by it, and not sort of throw it away because, they get 5 minutes in and everything's not laid out for them? That's a real relief. And that's because of gamers, that the gaming audience is now big enough and games are accessible enough through digital distribution and all that stuff that you can work. You don't have to work for everybody anymore. You can just work for people like you, and that's super exciting for me. And I guess for those games, harder games, games that require more investment, games that are a little more opaque than some of the games you've seen in the past, and I mean that in a positive way, that not everything's laid out in front of you, that exploration is rewarded, testing things out is rewarded, really digging in. The notion that community becomes part of the experience, that you don't like go to get a strategy guide, that tells you do X, Y, and Z, that figuring out the experience becomes a communal process is also super exciting. So I think that what's happened in the past few years, the games have been almost entirely great. The diversification of it, the willingness for people to say, we're not going to spoon feed this to you has been a wonderful thing. So I'm very inspired by all those games doing that. There's a lot. So too many to name.
Thank you very much. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
All right, that's all we've got time for now, but Ken, you're going to be out and about on the show floor during the rest of the day, so you should feel shy about coming up and saying hi to Ken if you see him.
Please, I'm not, come, whatever, I love meeting people, I'm here to meet people, so I'll just be walking around checking out the game, so if you see me, come up and say hi.
All right, thank you very much, Ken.